Or the Donald Trump new campaign advert, which is based on this case, based on how they're trying to shut me up because, you know, they want to shut you up. I'm not going to be shut up. I'm going to keep going to court every day. An incredible piece of advertising, really. Yet the case goes on. He continues to slag off the court and the judge and the prosecutor. It's quite a bizarre situation, really.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, obviously, it's unprecedented. But I think you have two things going on here. One is, you know, this is an outrageous case of election interference, right, or the weaponization of the justice system, like I've said many times. You don't have to like President Trump to see what's going on here. And you see a lot of prominent Democrats like Alan Dershowitz that have come out against this. But the second thing is, you know, they waited for, in this case, 7 years, and in the other cases, they waited 4 years to actually file these indictments. They only did that after he announced he was running for president. So it just shows you how blatant of this is and how blatant the election interference is. But he's converting it into a campaign, you know, and as much
probably
as
quite successfully.
Absolutely.
I mean, I see that in the last 3 or 4 polls I saw over the weekend, he's stretching his lead ahead of Biden.
Yeah, it depends on the polls. It's a little bit challenging this early, and you know, that Biden's come back a little bit in some polls. One of the big concerns that we have in the party is that there's polling on registered voters, but it doesn't really reflect the voters who plan on voting or will vote on Election Day. And Biden and the progressive left are now the party of the college-educated voter. And those voters always vote. Whereas the blue-collar, the working-class voters that have become a really important part of the Republican coalition, they're not as reliable. And so, you know, there's going to be voter registration and voter outreach, as well as get out the vote, is going to be really important.
Interesting. Now, going back to the case, they're basically accusing Donald Trump of committing election fraud. The prosecution have said that it's election fraud, pure and simple. The defense says Trump had no personal involvement in the payments. So that's going to be the crux of the case. But interesting, the first witness is going to be David Pecker, former publisher of the National Enquirer, who is accused of buying up negative stories about Donald Trump and basically not running them.
Burying them. Yeah, that should be interesting because, you know, again, how they turn this from a misdemeanor, which, you know, falsified business records is a misdemeanor in the state of New York. Alvin Bragg is a New York prosecutor that's prosecuting a federal law. And so there's so many holes in this thing.
Well, they're saying it's not simply an accounting issue, aren't they? They're trying to make out
they're going to tie it
that it's
to the campaign.
Illegal, you know, it's illegal under electoral law.
That's right, because they're going to try to connect it to a felony, which they have to do to make this misdemeanor a felony. However, they tried this, you know, the Republicans tried this with John Edwards, who was a candidate in 2008, and used, you know, campaign funds to pay off his mistress, and they actually voted against it. The court said, no, this is not a campaign expense. He didn't want his wife to find out. It's pretty, you know, it's quite obvious.
And,
so,
I mean, despite whether you may like Donald Trump for doing it, you know, having paid money to Stormy Daniels in order to keep her quiet, that's also not particularly a serious offence anyway.
No, unseemly, of course, but it's not illegal, and it's not even a misdemeanor. The falsifying the business expense, that's a misdemeanor, but it's one of those who cares, it's a speeding ticket, you know, pay the $100 fine. So what, you know, Alvin Bragg, who ran on his campaign slogan of I'm going to get Trump, is trying to stretch this from misdemeanor by connecting it to this campaign thing. The prosecutors in the past looked at this case and chose not to run it because it was so obscene.
And one of the things that was interesting last week, I thought, after his earlier appearance in court, was Donald Trump went up to Harlem, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to be a sort of a bedrock of Republican support, you know, relatively working class area, very ethnically mixed. And they loved him.
Absolutely.
And he was like getting cheered to the rafters. He went to a bodega, bought some stuff. He went over and talked to the cops who all love him.
Absolutely.
They were chanting his name.
I mean, this minority or identity group coalition that not only have the Democrats had for generations, but they depend on it. They cannot live with that. They cannot win that without it. No Democrat has won the white majority since LBJ in 1964. They're completely dependent on the black and Hispanic vote. That is frazzling. That is not holding in. So if Trump, all he has to do is get 20% of the African-American vote, and he wins.
Right. And as you've said before, there are 7 sort of swing states, as it were, aren't there? Or 6.
That's right.
Which, if he can win the majority of those,
that's right.
He's in anyway.
He's up 4 in the swing states. In those same states, he was down 5 this time in 2020.
Okay.
And then if you look at the issues, he's polling up 10 to up 25 on all the different major issues, the border, inflation, who's capable of handling it, who's physically and mentally aware enough. All of those metrics favored Biden by 10 points or more in 2020. Now they're favoring President Trump by 10 to 25.
Right,
it's phenomenal.
And I mean, the other, I suppose, interesting aspects of what was going on over in the States over the weekend was the voting through of the monies to Ukraine. A lot of Republicans not happy about that.
That's right.
A lot of right-wing Republicans particularly unhappy about Ukrainian flags being waved in the House of Representatives.
I thought that was obnoxious, and I think Mike Johnson did the right thing and said that's a violation of our decorum. So I thought that was a little much. I thought I was glad that the legislation passed on all 4 of the bills. I'm disappointed, of course, that the border security bill did not pass. You need a 2/3 majority for that. So they did get the majority, but not 2/3. But look, I totally understand some of the Republican pushback. 101 Republican House members voted for it, 112 against. Look, that's messy democracy. It's supposed to be messy. And it was bipartisan. Half the Republicans roughly voted for it. So, this isn't some outrageous, this is not some outrageous moment like you're hearing from MTG and others like her. But they put it up to the vote and it passed. So good for, I think,
but
good
the
for
flag
Mike
thing's
Johnson.
interesting because I'm looking at my St. George's flag here. It's St. George's Day tomorrow. Ridiculous in America that you would even have this conversation about the national flag because, every house in the States has an American Stars and Stripes flag.
Except, not every house, but not
Pretty
as much
though.
in New York and Washington and San Francisco. But yes, the people that live in the country, throughout the country and fly overland, they fly the flags. They're very proud of it. Then it's only at Columbia and Yale do you see
but that's a relatively
flag
recent
burning.
thing, isn't it? Where they'd rather wave the Palestinian flag than wave the US flag. But I mean, generally speaking, you would not be having conversations in America, certainly 10, 20 years ago, about the flag being racist, divisive.
It's much more patriotic there. It still is, in spite of some of the hiccups that we're experiencing in the last year.
I mean, you had it with the Confederate flag, haven't you? I mean, that sort of became something that was untenable, and people that used to fly it in the South now don't.
And you really can't. And I think that ship has sailed, and I think it's probably for the greater good. Look,
I was disappointed with the Dixie Chicks, though. I quite like that name. They changed it to the Chicks, and I was like, how does that work?
It's their political correctness started in America and was exported here. I regret to tell you, but I think it's the pushback has started against wokeness, and so far so good.
Right. So there are 34 counts, just going back to the trial briefly, of falsifying business records. I mean, do they have to prove all of those in order to get a conviction?
That's another part of the scam. It's one violation of this New York statute that's, again, a misdemeanor. What he did is he carved them up into 34 different counts by saying every time a payment was made, because he carved out the payments into, $10,000, for example, payments. So he segregated each payment and each recording of the payment in the books just to get 34 indictments, thinking that it makes it look bad. It makes it look worse for Trump. This guy was, even if he doesn't get a conviction, but if he gets one conviction, he should get all the
This reminds me of the Georgia case, right, where there's something like 96.
Same deal. I think it's 91
counts.
total.
91 total.
4.
Some of which involve things like an email being sent, which is one count. Right.
And look, that's prosecutors and the district attorneys frown on this. They always advise against their lawyers not to do that. It's very sleazy to do. Alvin Bragg did it anyway, but everything he's doing is sleazy at this point.
Well, it would seem so. And what about the jury? Because we were told it might take 2 weeks to get a jury together of people who didn't have an opinion on Donald Trump. They managed to do it in 2 days.
Yeah, the first day was rough. Last week we were here, and I think they didn't have any on the first day. But they managed to get it through. It probably took a few days longer than anticipated. But look, I think I'm still worried about that. It's New York City, it's Manhattan. If you look at they had some information about each juror, where they get their news sources. I mean, it's a lot of New York Times, a lot of TikTok. I think it's going to be difficult for him to get a fair trial. And Alvin Bragg and and the judge are doing their best to prevent Trump from getting his right to due process and his right to a fair trial. Now, having 4 indictments at the same time, 2 of which are active, also is really frowned upon by attorneys and district attorneys in America.
One of my favourite questions to the jury is, do you listen to talk radio? Which, of course, doesn't require them to listen to our version of talk radio. But, I mean, it's an interesting
in general,
question. They're sort of saying if you listen to talk radio, therefore
you're a conservative.
You're a right-wing nutcase.
Yeah, and there is that sort of stereotype.
Yeah.
And you know, look, I mean, I probably say the same thing about New York Times readers or Washington Post readers. And so is it fair? No, but it's probably pretty close.
Indicative,
it's
I suppose.
pretty accurate.
So, I mean, will it continue like this, do you think? I mean, will there be this ridiculous standoff between Donald Trump, former president, who comes out every day and says something that he's not supposed to say, but then nothing really happens to him?
Yeah, I mean, they've tried little versions of gag orders. They've had some restrictions on them. I don't know that it will work. I think, again, I can't call whether there's going to be conviction here because of the hostile jury pool. But I think this is going to help President Trump. 6 months ago, I was saying it's helping him in the nomination, but it will hurt him in the general. I'm not so sure about that anymore, Mike.
Because I think once it happens, you know, the shock, perhaps. I mean, we even, when we think about it as the first time a president has ever been prosecuted in a criminal case, once you get past saying those words, you realise that it may not be quite as damaging as it would at first appear.
Yes, because if it was a legitimate, you know, an actual crime, then you could say, wow, this, you know, you might have said that about Nixon if he had gone, you know, if they had gone through with the impeachment before he resigned. But, you know, look, this is so obviously a witch hunt, weaponization, and it's quite clear to me, but I think it's quite clear to Americans. And none of these cases, this is another way to look at it, none of these cases, especially the Alvin Bragg case, would have been prosecuted against anyone except Donald Trump.
Right, exactly. And so they've kind of drawn the facts gently towards what they hope will be a conclusion, in other words, right?
No, absolutely. And also coming from Alvin Bragg, who's deliberately reducing felony crimes, violent felony crimes in New York to misdemeanors so he can let violent criminals out on the street. It just makes it's so when you look at it in the context of that, and as well as, again, if you would file this indictment against anyone but a political opponent, which makes it all the more wrong to do it.
Incredible. It's very good to see you. As
Thanks,
ever,
Mike.
Greg Swenson from
Good to be